Okay, chapter 4, the Northern Colonies. Your opening vignette is about Roger Williams, how that he founded the Rhode Island colony after having been banished from the Massachusetts colony. I'll have more to say about him later. Now, the first settlers in the Massachusetts colony were mostly Puritan. All right, here's the story of Puritanism. Puritanism began in England. The idea was that they were going to purify the Church of England. Now, a lot of Protestants had studied Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, and these were reformers, and they had decided that the Church of England did not go far enough, that there was needed more breaking away from Catholicism. Now, King Henry had broken away from the Church of England. And owing to, well, some of you might know the story, but I'll give the highlights. King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope wouldn't let him because Catherine was too closely related to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. The Pope did not want to make Charles V angry, so the Pope told King Henry, "You cannot divorce your wife." So Henry then broke away from the church, divorced that wife, married another woman, and wound up killing her. All told, he wound up marrying 6 wives and probably would have killed the 6th one. He didn't kill all, he only killed two of his wives, divorced another 2. No, he would not kill Catherine of Aragon. Don't get the impression. Catherine of Aragon, again, was too closely related to Charles V. But he divorced Catherine, killed his 2nd wife, divorced his other wife, but his last one, except for one thing, he died before he had a chance to carry out his divorce on his last wife. So the 6th one survived him. Anyway, a lot of persons believed that Henry had not broken far enough from the Catholic Church. They wanted to purify the church. The kings of England at the time were not interested in purifying the church, particularly the person who succeeded Henry. His son was weak and sickly, but under him, the Anglican Church got farther from Catholicism, but still did not break far enough. Then under the kings that followed, some of them were Catholic, some were Protestant. England went back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. But finally, during the time of some of these kings, King James and King Charles I, who followed James, under the leadership of some of these kings, some of the Puritans were persecuted as being too extreme or too radical. So a lot of them decided, we're going to come to the New World. Particularly, there was an extreme group of Puritans called Separatists who wanted to completely separate from the Church of England like Luther had done. They were part of the Puritans, but they were a different extreme group. When some Separatists came to the New World, they intended to go to Virginia. But on the course of going to Virginia, they got blown off course, and they wound up far off in Massachusetts. When they landed, they realized, oh, we're not in Virginia. But at this time, the temperatures were cold, and if any of you know anything about New England winters, they can be very cold, but the temperatures were cold. So the Separatists established the Plymouth colony in what is today Massachusetts, and they remained there. They came with their wives and families, so from the beginning there was an equal number of men and women. But they did not do well. They did not thrive very well. In fact, they would not have survived had not been helped by Indians. But in 1630, another group of Puritans arrived. They just left the Separatists alone as being too extreme, but nevertheless, the two of them, they ignored each other, got along. But in 1630, some more Puritans arrived, and they set up a colony in Massachusetts Bay. And the colony, like the other colony, experienced a starving time at first. But eventually they caught on to how to farm. More people came, more people were born. The population grew really slowly at first. And then the population got to growing faster. What happened? Well, the persecution in England got more intense against the Puritans. And the Puritans realized we have to come. So a lot of times, a preacher who had been kicked out of the Anglican Church for his views would decide he was going to move his entire congregation. So he'd take as many of his congregation as he could, and they'd all board a big ship and come to Massachusetts. People came in droves, and an equal number of women came as men, unlike in Virginia. And they started having families. And the Massachusetts colony kept growing. Again, you might be aware I'm leaving a whole lot out, but that's because there's a whole lot more, because we could spend the entire semester talking just about the Massachusetts colony. But the Massachusetts colony wanted to set itself up as a city on a hill. In other words, we're going to become an example for the whole world as to what the government should be, as to what politics should be. We're going to be the light to the whole world, the city on a hill with a big lighthouse, and everybody will look up to us. Now, folk, some of you will see on the test one question that will be, what do the Puritans and us have in common? To this day, America looks on itself as being like a beacon to the world, spreading not Christianity, but democracy. And everywhere we go, we try to convince people that our way of life, our government is the best, our democracy is the best. So the Puritan, in that regard, we're like the Puritans. We believe that we're the best people in the world, and everybody should copy us, and everybody should do as we do.
So Puritans believe that everyone should have the same belief.
That was their mistake. Yeah, you're jumping ahead of me a little bit. They believed, like Martin Luther did, that if everybody read their Bible the same way he did, they would believe as he believed. The Puritans believed if everybody studied the same things they did, they would all believe alike, and folk, nothing could be farther from the truth. Now, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and I tell you, if you put a piece of aluminum in an oven and heat that oven to a certain temperature for so long and put it out and quench that aluminum in oil, it'll turn out a certain way. And if you take another piece and do the same thing, that piece of aluminum will turn out the same way the first one did. Or if you take a cake and put it in the oven and heat it to this correct temperature for this correct amount of time, it'll turn out the same way as every cake that's put in the oven will do. Hostess Twinkies makes cake after cake after cake after cake on the million, and they all taste alike. But I can guarantee you, all of you will not answer the same questions the same way on the next test I give. Even if you're sitting in the same class, listening to the same teacher, hopefully reading the same book, you won't all get the same answers. You don't all form the same opinions. And this is where the Puritans made the same mistake that Luther did. They did not tolerate dissent. Now, this really was one thing that could have gotten America off to a bad start. The greatest freedom we have is the freedom to dissent, to disagree. When the Wright brothers were putting together an airplane, one college professor said, man will never fly a heavier than air machine, and he proved it mathematically. His math was wrong, but nevertheless he proved it, that man cannot fly a heavier than air machine. So a few days later, the Wright brothers flew one. When a man named Drake believed that you can get oil from underground by drilling, that there's oil underground, he was called a fool. They called it Drake's folly. He drilled and the oil gushed up after a while. Some of the biggest discoveries were made by people who were told it can't be done. But they said, yes, it can. Dissent, disagree. If you don't allow disagreement, you become stagnant. Anyway, the Puritans did not, as we'll talk about later. Now, the Puritans followed the teachings of John Calvin, who believed in predestination. Now, the Puritans believed that you could do nothing to earn your salvation, that God knew before he made the earth who would be saved and who would be lost, and we had no control of it. That God chose whomever God chose. And everybody could only hope that they were among the chosen or the elect. That only the elect could be saved, only the elect would be saved. And we had no individual choice in it. Now, let me once again pause here to state some of the stuff that I have to teach about, I do not believe myself. I hope you understand. And the reason I have to mention is because it's part of the lesson. I'm not trying to push predestination down your throat, but nevertheless, if you had lived in Puritan New England, they would certainly have tried to do so, but I am not. But nevertheless, I'm teaching about it because it's an important, it explains what made these people tick. But anyway, they believed that you were predestined for all eternity. Now, and you could only hope. Now, they believed also that if you liked going to church and you liked hymn singing and liked Bible reading, you were probably among the elect. And if you had no interest in religious matters, you probably weren't, but you had no control over it and you could do nothing about it. All right. Women and children made up the vast majority of the Puritan colony because, again, the men took their women and children along when they came in. A plague had wiped out most of the Indians already. We don't know what, but it's possible that fishermen had come there and landed and, without meaning to, spread smallpox and typhus and maybe measles among the American Indians. And whatever it was, it killed off most of them until there were few in number. Now, you might think this is a thing of the past. I heard yesterday and heard today there is a plague that's making national news in Oregon, measles. And some of you might not even be aware of it. But the measles is brought about by a bunch of parents who do not want to have their children vaccinated because they believe that vaccinations lead to autism. The reason I'm bringing this up, number one, is one of my sisters strongly believed this. I don't know if she still does or not. Don't want to talk to her about it, but she strongly believed that vaccinations led to autism in children. I do not subscribe to that myself, and neither did my dad. And when I joined the Army, I mean, they vaccinated me with all kinds of stuff. I don't even know what all, and our arms were sore for days. Oh yes, but anyway, that's a different story. But anyway, the Indians were largely wiped out by a plague. Now, the Puritans claimed that they believed in separation of church and state. And they prided themselves, they would tell their Catholic counterpart, you join church and state, but we believe in separation. In actual reality, the Puritans joined church and state more than any other Christian group in history. And they didn't realize it. They were blind to it. They were blind to the fact that they lacked the dissent. Now, I want to state, I mean, Puritanism disgraced itself, and I'll be telling you later how there are no Puritans today. They go by a different name. They call themselves Congregational. The word Puritan now has a bad connotation, again, because of some things that they did that disgraced themselves. The church had the government pass laws that enforced Christian morality. Again, the Puritans were the worst example of this. And folk, I've got to say this, something I heard many, many years ago. Neither Jesus nor any of the disciples ever went to a secular ruler and asked a secular ruler to pass laws favoring Christian morality. It wasn't done. But then Christianity became more and more numerous, and it began to influence the church in ways that maybe it didn't need to or shouldn't have. But nevertheless, the Puritans influenced their secular rulers to pass laws favoring their morality. One thing, though, that they did, too, initially, the land was somewhat evenly divided. They'd have plots of land when they settled, and, well, I'll draw it. They tended to, they'd have a central area called a green. And then around the green would be their houses. And they'd put these houses around the green, and in the middle of the common. They'd oftentimes meet in the green or graze their horses in the village green. And then their farms would be, their plots of land would be in their backyard, where they'd all have a fairly equal sized plot of land. that they would work their farm on. This was a typical New England town. Now, and also they began to hold town meetings, and this is something they still do. This I want to commend them for. They would hold town meetings, and at these meetings they would discuss the issues that was bothering them or the things that they were facing. But the New England town meeting was one of the most democratic institutions in the country, and they would do this they've been doing this for generations. But it was said that the New England people spent their time watching their neighbors, not looking at themselves, looking at them, making sure their neighbors were not getting out of line, or another way of putting it, making sure their neighbors were not having any fun. If anybody was doing anything amiss, the whole community would get after them. Anyway, now, like I said, they had some problems. Your book opens up with Roger Williams. Now, if you actually go into detail, we don't have time to, but you go in detail and study these issues, it's difficult to determine who was right and who was wrong on most of these issues. Now, I had a student do a paper just a couple of semesters ago, and this paper was on the conquest of the Aztecs by Cortez, and he made an interesting statement. He said if you actually look at the morality of the Spanish and the morality of the Indians, it's hard to tell which one of them was more immoral than the other, or which one of them was more wicked than the other. Now, I'm supposed to not, son, I'm not going to take any side in politics, but during the last election in 2016, it was difficult to tell which one of the presidential candidates was more corrupt than the other. I mean, that's, you might say, I'm not supposed to say that. Maybe I'm not. But again, I'm not taking sides. To me, they both were so bad that it's hard to tell which one of them was worse. I see a few heads nodding. Well, again, in the course of a discussion, I'll start with Roger Williams. Roger Williams began to protest two things. He protested the fact that you had to be a church member in order to vote and hold office. Now, I want to say this about church membership. Until very recently, there was no law on the books, during my lifetime, in any state that required church membership to hold office. But every politician, until recently, was a church member. He had to be in order to get votes. Now, today we have a few people who claim to be outright atheists who are serving, and we have at least one Muslim serving high up in our government. But at one time, you didn't, officially, it was not on the books, you understand? But you had to be a church member in order to have any chance of winning. But this goes back to New England times. Well, Roger Williams was upset because it was required. Now, so Roger Williams went off and started his own colony. When he got to his own colony, everybody who ran for office was a church member, just the same as they had been in Massachusetts. The other thing that Roger Williams did not like was the treatment of the Indians. Roger Williams said that the English people, the Europeans, had no right to go in and take Indian land, especially without paying for the Indians. He also said the Indians were being cheated and mistreated. Oh, I talked about this last class. It's almost like he was right. But again, I think he was living in an unreal world. If you want to try to tell me that the American Indians were cheated, you have every right to do that, but I think you're not living in the world of reality. In the real world, if you conduct yourself the way they did, you're going to lose everything you have. But anyway, Roger Williams was finally banished from the colony for his criticism. Folk, give me a little bit of liberty here. In a public school, what I'm about to do would be illegal. But this is college. What I'm about to do, I know is legal here. I'm going to quote one passage in the Bible from St. Paul, who said, and I'll quote him, "One person believes it's okay to do this. Another person believes it's wrong to do this. Let both live in harmony. Let the person who doesn't believe not judge a person who does, and let the person who does believe not judge the person who doesn't." He said that. I see at least one person nodding your head like you've heard that before. He actually said that. If Christianity would have done this all the way down through the ages, but it didn't. Let the other person believe, and if you give them enough time, if you're right, they'll come around to your way of thinking, and if they're right, you'll eventually come around to theirs. The thing you fight the hardest against in one generation, in one part of your life, you're going to embrace in another part of your same life. Most of us will change our opinions at one time or another, sometime during our lifetime. I have. Anyway, now, next one, Anne Hutchinson. Oh, man. All right. Anne Hutchinson, her name is in every American history book I've seen since I was in the 8th grade. So the feminists really love her. She was born in England. She married. All told, she had, I believe, about 14 children. But during the course of her marriage, early in her marriage, she happened to hear a preacher named John Cotton. And her and her husband were really enamored by John Cotton's preaching, so every chance they got, they would go for miles to hear John Cotton. The problem was they had to go by horse and buggy, or a horseback, and dragging a bunch of children of various ages from toddler on up was not an easy task, so they could only go visit John Cotton's church when the weather was nice. But she became really enamored with John Cotton's teaching. Well, John Cotton was not liked by his church, so to keep him going to jail, John Cotton went to Massachusetts. The Hutchinson family were going to follow her, but she was pregnant at the time, so she had to wait, even though in the case of John Cotton, his wife was pregnant also, but he could not wait because he had to get out of town now, so his wife's baby was born while they were on the ship. But the Hutchinsons sent their oldest son to Massachusetts ahead of them, saying, we're going to come later, we'll come next year. So the son was to go get things ready for his parents to arrive, which he did. So the son went, and John Cotton went to Massachusetts. A year later, Anne Hutchinson, her husband, and the rest of the family went to Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson became a midwife, helping women who were to deliver children. And her husband became a successful in his business, and because there wasn't anybody that had his occupation there in Massachusetts time, so he became highly successful in his business. She became successful at hers. But then she started listening to John Cotton more, and then she started holding meetings at her house that only invited women, in which she would discuss the sermons she heard from John Cotton, and she would explain to these women what she thought he meant. This, again, if you look at in detail, and I'm not going to go into because this is not a theology class, but the point I'm trying to make is the shades of opinion were so fine that it's really difficult to tell which side was right and which side was wrong, because it was, her opinion was like borderline between heresy and reality, or heresy and true doctrine, to the point where it was really, really difficult to determine who was the good person and the bad. But nevertheless, her teaching began to get the governor alarmed, and keep in mind her house was right smack dab next to the governor's. And folk, I got some advice for you. I mean, this applies to me. I personally try to keep as far from my boss as I can. Keep out of his hair, and unless I see him, I figure the longer I'll laugh. But she had a knack for putting her home right smack dab next to the governor. Eventually it got her killed, but that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Anyway, the governor became alarmed. To make a long story short, they called her before a trial, a jury, and the jurors had already made up their minds that she was guilty. She did not have any lawyer on her side, but she was tried for the crime of heresy. Heresy means she disagreed with the views of the mainstream, or the views of the church. Of course, she was convicted. There were two things convicted her. Number one, she claimed that she had gotten revelation straight from God, and that these revelations that she had gotten from God had more authority than the Bible itself. To most Christians, this is heresy. I mean, but again, you can decide for yourself. But she believed that everybody could and did hear directly from God, and she had. She predicted that the Massachusetts colony was going to be destroyed. It never was, but nevertheless, she predicted it. So to make a long story short now, they kicked her out of the Massachusetts colony. She and her husband and most of her children then went south to Roger Williams' colony at Rhode Island, and there she parked herself next to the governor. She ingratiated herself to one governor, then fell out with him, so she got that governor unelected. She ingratiated herself to the next governor. She fell out with him, so the first governor she had, he got reelected, and he kicked her out of the Rhode Island colony. By this time, her husband had died, so she took about 6 of her remaining children and went to went to Long Island, what is today New York. And there, she and her children that were left were waylaid by Indians. She was killed except for one 9-year-old girl who was redheaded, and this 9-year-old girl hid herself, or she was out picking berries or something. Anyway, she was in hiding. The Indians found her, but they were fascinated with her red hair, so they took her and made a captive of her. Eventually, she was ransomed by some of her relatives who still lived in Massachusetts. Now, the point I'm trying to make is things did not go well. I mean, she is not blamed by today's standards for her beliefs. By today's standards, the Puritans are blamed. Yes?
After she was kicked out of the Rhode Island colony, where did she go after that?
She went to Long Island. This is Rhode Island, Long Island. Now, the white men who rose up, and they drove all the Indians off Long Island, again, because whatever else she was a white woman. But a lot of persons at the time believed that she was justifiably killed for her heresy, and that your book has a quote where that's one of the men said, "I do cast," that's spelled do, D-O-E, "I do cast thee out and assign thee to hell for all eternity." Again, this was beyond the authority of a human organization or human church to do that, but nevertheless, the Puritans did. Many famous persons have been descended from her, including recent presidents. The 2 Bushes, George Bush and George Bush, father and son, are descended from Anne Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson, who we'll talk about before the lesson is over, she was a great-great-grandson of his. And several court justices high up have been descended from her. And I believe on his mother's side, Barack Obama also was. So your book mentions several persons who were descended from her. Now, folks, this might be a little bit off the record, but there's a part of me that I was reading, and I've read about her several times, including just last night. I did some research on her. I sometimes wonder if she did not have a crush on John Cotton. I mean, what might they call her crush? Again, you don't have to believe it. It can't be easily proven. But she kept trying to ingratiate herself to John Cotton, and he was instrumental in getting her kicked out of the colony. And he told the judges that she had said some things to him that made his mind think about sex. Again, something that at that time was very, very anathema. Again, if you look at her theology, she was bordering on saying that the elect, and she was accused of, she denied having said it, but it was borderline and said that the elect could not commit any sin, or in other words, any action of the elect was not a sin. And this doctrine is called antinomianism, that if you're a member of the elect, you will not commit any sin at all. Again, each of you, I'm going to let you all make up your mind yourself what you believe about this. Anne Hutchinson is looked on very highly among today's feminists as being a woman who stood up for what she believed, regardless of whether you agree with what she believed or not, and dared say to the governor and to the judges and to the jury who condemned her, "This is what I think." All right. Now, Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker also disagreed with the governor of Massachusetts. Again, the issue with him was the church's practice of only allowing members to vote and to hold office or to serve on juries. And if you weren't a church member, you were nothing. Thomas Hooker said church membership should be voluntary and not coerced. They kicked him out of the Massachusetts colony also. He took 800 settlers with him who agreed with him, went to Connecticut. And again, once in Connecticut, he set up a democracy, and every politician was a church member. So what was the big deal? I mean, yeah, hey, probably every one of you would say he was right in it. You shouldn't require church membership as a prerequisite to hold office. But then for many, many generations, every politician